first international conference about the climate happened in 1979 in Geneva. About the same time, conferences were happening about the ozone layer depletion in the atmosphere. The first negotiation round about the ozone depletion occurred in 1982, and in 1987, the Montreal Protocol was ratified by 197 countries. The Montreal Protocol, in its origins, established controls for the consumption and production of 8 substances that reduce the ozone layer, being the main one the CFC, chlorofluorocarbon, including just the developed countries. Afterwards, developing countries were included, and the number of controlled substances gradually increased to 95 in 1999. The agreement can be considered successful, as the consumption and production of these substances have since then decreased to the point that the ozone layer has started to recover. The same cannot be said of the climate change agreements. In 1988, the Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere established that a necessary and timely action should be taken to deal with climate change within a global framework. In 1992, the Rio Earth Summit took place, organized by the United Nations, and 3 conventions were adopted. The main one, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. 195 countries agreed then in meeting annually at the so-called COPs, Conference of the Parties, to monitor the implementation of the decisions taken and to continue the negotiations. One of the main treaties on climate change was signed by the developed countries at the COP3 in Kyoto, Japan, 1995. The Kyoto Protocol focused on mitigation, that is, the reduction of the greenhouse gases emissions by the developed countries, historically, to that date, the main emitters, with specific reduction targets by country. Its results were less than expected, and for 2012, when the commitments made in Kyoto would expire, a new agreement was planned, one involving the developing countries as well. By that time, China had become the greatest emitter of GHGs in the world, followed by the United States. The preparation for this agreement would be made at COP15 in Copenhagen. The Copenhagen Agreement was preceded by huge expectations, but it failed in creating a binding agreement. New attempts were made until 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed. The differences between the treaties related to the ozone layer depletion and the ones related to the climate change are many, but among them, we can highlight some that could have helped in the success of the first and the current failure of the latter. 1. The subject of the ozone layer is less complex and easier to be popularized than the climate change. The hole in the ozone layer was visible in photos taken of Antarctica from the space, and it was directly linked to the increase of the ultraviolet rays incidence, which on its turn was directly linked to the increase in skin cancer and cataracts. 2. The measures to protect the ozone layer were much less expensive than the costs of decarbonizing the economy of today. 3. Technologies were rapidly developed to substitute the CFCs at reasonable costs. And 4. the CFC emitters were more concentrated in fewer countries, economic sectors, and companies than the ones involved in climate change. The Paris Agreement is currently the greatest hope in reverting the failure trend of the climate change agreements. In our next video, we'll talk about climate change and inequality. Until then,